Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to Trusted Democracy in the Digital Age. Thank you all for choosing to be with us here today. My name is David Adams. I'm the University of Cincinnati's Innovation Officer and the lead architect for the Cincinnati Innovation District, a connected talent cluster that serves as a model to transform our cities, organizations, and individuals. When the governor and lieutenant governor unveiled the Cincinnati Innovation District last year, they indicated that Cincinnati will be we believe we have a model for our state and the nation. The conversation today is timely. As a country, we continue to be challenged by the divergence of communities, rural versus urban, and the divergence of cities between the so-called superstar coastal cities and the heartland cities. Some may say that today's panel discussion topic is a symptom of our nation's city divergence. Recent studies from the Brookings Institute points to this divide as a grave national problem and a winner-take-most network of economies. Leading up to our nation's 59th presidential inauguration, and after the tragic events that took place at our US Capitol, this panel will discuss online messaging, how it can both bolster and undermine the confidence in our electoral integrity, and how we as a nation should address such digital campaigns now and into the future. I'm excited to join the Office of Research to welcome you all to this sensational panel discussion. This is the third conversation of consequence in the Flashpoint series, a series hosted by the UC Office of Research, University of Cincinnati's Institute for the Advanced Study of Democracy and Culture, and launched by the Digital Futures Initiative. The University of Cincinnati's Digital Futures is a major research initiative of Research 2030. This is UC's 10-year strategic plan for research and will be housed in the nearly 200,000 square feet UC Digital Future Interdisciplinary Research Building, being constructed within the Cincinnati Innovation District. Digital Futures Technology Forward Research Program is going to be a major driver of UC's success moving forward, societal transformation through use-inspired applied research, and the success of the Cincinnati Innovation District as we endeavor to accelerate STEM graduates by 15,000 and research by 2 billion over the next 10 years. I'd like to give a quick thanks to the event organizer, Max Cormedy, and the event sponsors, the University of Cincinnati Office of Research and the Institute for the Advanced Study of Democracy and Culture. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jay Shubria, and turn the floor over to him. Jay has served at the highest levels of business and is a senior advisor to former Governor John Kasich here in Ohio. Currently, Jay is a managing director at Mercury, a global strategy firm, and he is working closely with the UC Office of Research, their leadership, to scale up the digital futures efforts. And with that, Jay, the floor is all yours.
David, I want to thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I also want to say that under your leadership, the Cincinnati Innovation District is becoming a world-class magnet for advanced solutions. And your collaboration with it, with Digital Futures, it's really critical. So appreciate you being here with us today. This is the third conversation of consequence in our Flashpoint series. These conversations are free, open to the public, live streamed, and will be spotlighted during Research and Innovation Week happening March 29th through April 2nd, 2021. So mark your calendar because there's a lot of great discussion going on at that time. Digital Futures is all about solving problems that matter. This conversation is taking place just days before Joe Biden will be inaugurated, days after Donald Trump was impeached for the second time, and a little bit more than a week after our Capitol was attacked. I can think of no bigger problem in our nation that needs solving than the growing distrust a tremendous amount of our population has in elections and in historically important institutions. Our panelists today, they represent many of those critical institutions. While we may not be able to solve that issue today, we're going to ask the panel what they think that can happen to improve the situation. So we're going to go right at it, and we're going to introduce our panelists. But if you have a question for this panel, please email us at research@uc.edu. That's research@uc.edu, and we'll try to ask it. First, Richard Harknett. He is the head of the political science department at the University of Cincinnati, and he chairs the Center for Cyber Strategy and Policy. As one of the world's leading experts on cybersecurity, he advises leaders at all levels of government and the private sector. And I know he was just on a phone call with a lot of elected officials yesterday talking about cybersecurity. Katie Harbath is the public policy director for global elections at Facebook. Prior to joining Facebook, she served on leadership roles on presidential, congressional, and senatorial campaigns. She's worked on more elections of importance than any person I know. And Anna Palmer is the CEO and founder of Punchbowl News. This is the newest news outlet covering politics and policy in our nation's capital. Prior to that, she was a co-author of Politico's Playbook. A lot of the news you see reported in other outlets, well, Anna reports on it first. I signed up early for Punchbowl, and I urge you to do the same. Their AM newsletters are a terrific read, and you can do that at punchbowl.news. That's punchbowl.news. And last but not least is Trey Grayson, who is the former two-term Secretary of State for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He also ran for the United States Senate. He's recognized as a national leader in election modernization and is currently a director at Civic Point, a public affairs firm. So first of all, this is an all-star panel. It's really fantastic. A couple of you are living in DC where all of the news is happening now, but we're going to go straight into it. And Richard, I'm going to ask you first. You've been researching disinformation campaigns in this last election. I'd wonder if you could give us a thumbnail sketch of what your research is and what your findings are, so we can kind of frame the rest of this discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Jay, and thanks for everybody for joining us today. So the Center for Cyber Strategy and Policy was instrumental in the development of the doctrine of persistent engagement that's been adopted in the U.S. Defense strategy, and that put us into a modality of anticipation for primarily strategic competition. Right, we got adversaries out there that want to undermine American power, and so as we started to think about the 2020 election back in 2019. We began as researchers within the center to look at the focus on disinformation and misinformation. And our take became a little different. And that was that the problem really isn't disinformation per se. Understanding it's a means to something else. And the something else was delegitimization of trust in the election itself, whether it be in the process or in the result. And so if you frame the problem as delegitimization, the question then became for us as a researcher is, how do you counter those campaigns, right? How do you counter intentional efforts to use disinformation, misinformation, to achieve that end of delegitimization? What does a counter delegitimization campaign look like? And so we posited back in the spring, what are some of the key trust agents that we could test? And the one that we landed on were secretaries of state. A lot of people back, just a year ago, didn't know much about Secretary of State. No offense there, Trey.
Not
a political office that jumps to the mind, right? But we argued that if, in fact, we had dedicated delegitimization campaigns against elections, the chief election officer in the states may become more important. So we ran a national experiment, about 8,000 subjects, in which we tested them against cues to try to undermine the legitimacy, their trust in the election, and then use the Secretary of State role to try to counter that. And while we're still working through the results, the big finding, not surprisingly, was that in the midst of elections, it's the wrong time to try to build and sustain trust in institutional authority, particularly in the election process or election result. Why? Because people's filters, right, their partisan filters, are as intense as they're going to get, right? And so the question then becomes, from a counter delegitimization campaign standpoint, what strategies do we have to use? But most importantly, when do you have to start them? And so I'm sure we'll get into this, Jay, but pretty much if we need to think about 2022 and 2024, we need to start now, right, outside of the election cycle, in reestablishing that trust. And I'll leave you with that point as a starting, reestablish. So our research was prior to the election. What we have to recognize clearly, particularly after last week bringing into stark relief, right, is that sustaining trust and rebuilding trust are two different things. And we are now clearly in a situation in which emphasis has to be on rebuilding trust. And that has to occur through media, through our technology companies, and through our elected officials. And I'm excited to have three of those representatives on this panel today to join us in this discussion.
Yeah, Richard, that's all really interesting points, and we will get to some of these solutions and how we can reestablish trust and some of these strategies. I do want to turn to Katie now, because I mean, obviously, there's a lot going on in the news, especially with quote big tech companies, and you know, Facebook and others have taken some unprecedented steps this last week, where you've actually, at some level, restricted or removed the president from certain platforms. Now, these decisions have become highly political, and I know you don't speak for Twitter or these other companies, but how worried are you that a large portion of the country believes that big tech is now censoring their voice? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Jay, and thanks for having me as part of this. These decisions were not taken lightly. And you can see over the last couple of years, and having been in the middle of it and have grappled a lot with where are the lines of drawing this and trying to really fight to allow for free expression, to take an unprecedented step like this was certainly not one that was easy or taken lightly. But in light of the violence and the changing context in which was unfolding in front of our eyes, it was something that we felt that we needed to do. That aside, there is still quite a bit of variety of voices that continue to remain on the platform, and I think that one of the things that we need to continue to do is to understand what are the societal norms that we are going to want to continue to build up on social media platforms where people are having these conversations, and where should the lines continue to be in terms of, and what should the penalties be for certain different types of speech and organizing that people may be doing on our platforms and others. And so just wanted to folks know it was not a decision that was taken lightly, and letting people to still have their rights of free expression is still something that's very important to the company.
I appreciate that, and we'll get into that a little bit more too. And look, this is a pretty intense debate that's on Capitol Hill that separates conservatives and liberals, and they both want different solutions. Anna, I'd love to come to you and your reflections to this debate. I think if Republicans had held the Senate, it would have taken on a different flavor. But now that Democrats kind of control all facets of the federal government, how do you see this particular debate going, Section 230, so which can get into the weeds, but just this debate about big tech and freedom of speech? And you're on mute, Anna.
Technology. We're like 6 months, 9 months into this, but now I'm unmuted. All right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. So what I would say is a couple of things. One, I think, tech was the darling for both Republicans and Democrats for a long time and has now been in the crosshairs for at least the last couple of years. So I don't think that this is a new revelation that members of Congress are going to be training their ire against rules or regulations. That kind of friction has been happening for a long time. I think this just is going to really make it a bigger issue, right? I think you're going to have Democrats and Republicans now that want to look at investigative hearings. I think there's issues around all kinds of things that tech in kind of Congress are going to come up against each other with regulations in the next year. I do think Republicans are going to continue to use this kind of, issue as feeling like they're being censored or that there's not a place for them. And I think you're going to see that be one of the new rallying cries. You've started to see it in fundraisers, kind of solicitations online. This is going to be something that they're going to turn to as a reason to try to have enforcement hearings or try to have, hearings that bring up some of the leaders of all of the tech companies. I don't think it's just one. I think that there are going to be a variety of them that are going to have to face kind of congressional scrutiny. But I think at this point, you're right. I think because it's an all Democratic Washington, it is a different tone. It is a different tenor. And we'll have to see where, I think particularly the Biden administration comes out on this. We haven't heard a lot about where their focus is going to be on this issue.
Yeah, it's something that I watch for because, look, I do think this is one of those unifying things for conservatives. This and China are the two real kind of issues going to the next Congress that kind of unifies them even beyond the Trump years. So those are great observations. Trey, I'm going to come to you now. You're a former Secretary of State. Some of these issues didn't exist when you were Secretary of State, which wasn't that long ago. But I know you also advise Secretaries of State as they take office. There are going to be a whole new set of them that are taking office this year. What would you like to tell them about this particular issue? Because it's something that so dominates what they do.
Yeah, no, really, when I was secretary, which was from 2004 through 2011, Facebook was becoming, popular, but not like it is today. Snapchat didn't exist, TikTok didn't exist. Twitter was around, but more towards the end, but people were still figuring out how to use them. We were figuring out how to use them as government officials. Citizens were figuring out how to use them. Campaigns were figuring out how to use them. So it's a very different environment. I think the biggest thing, and I think Richard, I want to come back to something Richard said about building that trust and building it up early. That to me is a good lesson. One of the challenges for election administrators is people care the most about what you have to say around the time of an election. And as Richard points out, you really need to build up those relationships and topic earlier. And I think one of the things that I learned by watching this election, I would say, is that a lot of people people vote, but they don't really know what goes on behind the scenes. They don't know the counting process and all the steps that are taken to ensure the security of an election system. So that's something that I would, to get to your specific question, I would recommend is be transparent and open about these processes. Let's be educational. Let people know about how in most jurisdictions you have party representation, the general public, the media is baked into this system. The different safeguards that take place to verify signatures and things like that. And also to explain that votes aren't dumped, they're just counted, and when the results are reported, that's not a vote dump. Now, there's some policy things you can do to try to impact. I think another change is we need to have the ability to have more results quicker that are still accurate. But I think that's one thing that we could do because it does sow some doubt. But it's tough when you have the most powerful figure in the world lying about an election system and laying the groundwork for that lie. That delegitimization started. And I'm going to call Trump out. I'm a Republican. I'm still a Republican. But Trump delegitimized vote by mail to sow doubts. Because and the result of that was a two for one. Republicans tended to not vote by mail as much as Democrats, so that created a red mirage and a blue shift effect. And then that allowed Trump to say, "Look, I'm winning. Why are we still counting all these votes?" And then when folks either wanted to believe him or just didn't know better, it created an environment where that delegitimization was pretty dangerous. So early, transparent communication, and I think more about that process. And explaining how it works and using the media as a partner, working with folks like Anna and her colleagues and also Katie and her colleagues to disseminate that message out. They're your allies and friends in this. And they were certainly helpful in general, the media in 2020 with all the changes because of the pandemic. The rules changed, we had to communicate it, and it wouldn't have gone as well as it did without our partners in the media and tech.
Look, clear communication is good advice for any elected official, not just Secretaries of State. So I think that's very wise. And I think that you tailoring it to that audience is really prescient. So hopefully they're listening, and we'll probably send this out to them too. It's good advice.
For Rose. He does a good job in Ohio.
Like my friend Frank, exactly. Katie, I'm going to come back to you. Another thing that happened a little bit controversial this last election cycle, Facebook took a step at times to ban political ads this past election cycle. I'd love for you to kind of inform us about what went behind that thinking, because it was hit by both sides. I saw Democrats and Republicans hitting that decision. And so I'm sure that was not a decision taken lightly either.
Yeah, to zoom out a little bit to give context. So in May of 2018, we launched tools and requirements for political and issue ads to not only have disclaimers on them, but they also went into an ad archive so that people could see a range of the number of impressions they got, how much money was spent, et cetera, to try to just bring more transparency to those ads. And that was in response to a lot of complaints coming out of 2016 of not really knowing what President Trump, Secretary Clinton, and their allies had been running on the platform, and also in response to the ads that were run by Russia on our platform in 2016. We continue to evolve those tools, and in fall of 2019, there was Twitter decided to ban political ads altogether, and there was a question of whether or not we were going to do the same. But we had strong indicators, to your point, across the political spectrum that they did not want us to ban political ads because of how much they were utilizing them to reach out to their voters. We did take the unprecedented step of allowing no new ads to be created in the week leading up to the election. This was because we wanted to make sure that organizations and campaigns and people could run your get out the vote ads and other things that we needed to make sure people had the right information. But we didn't want any new ads created to make sure that there was enough time that if somebody was running the ad and if they tried to do it a day or two before the election, that's not usually enough time to debunk or to have robust conversation about the topic of those ads. And so we thought best to say no new ones in the week of. And then we banned political and issue ads completely after the election. We did open it up for a bit for Georgia for the special, but they're banned now again. And we haven't yet said when we'll be turning those back on, but we chose to do that ban because of our concern of what people may be putting out there to try to delegitimize the election. Still, it's the first time we've done that in an election. And I think I was saying to somebody today, we still haven't really had a chance to really decompress everything that's happened over the last 2 years and really think about what worked, what didn't. And I know we'll get into this too, but I think this is a big area where I think we need to consider regulation and to think about where those things need to go.
Yeah, I do absolutely want to get into what Facebook thinks needs to be regulated. And the other point is, I don't know that any one of us has ever decompressed from this last 4 years, these last 2 years. I don't know when we're going to decompress. So when you get that, please put it on my calendar because I want to take time to do that. Richard, I'm going to come back to you now. Look, Katie just mentioned Russia in her last answer. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the difference between foreign actors and domestic actors in the current state of disinformation. How you see that.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. When we started our research, it was mainly focused on, adversaries of the United States that may want to leverage delegitimization to undermine U.S. power, right? And so that still exists, right? And in fact, from public reporting, we know that there's been activity up and through. There wasn't a significant amount because, in fact, the United States got better at anticipating it and defending it and containing it. But what we have to assume is that those adversaries continue to try to leverage the political divisions in society today. But this is the interesting connection right now. And when Katie talks about a regulatory environment, we tend to think about a regulatory environment in the domestic situation, and we think about national security or international security, right, to deal with foreign adversaries. And so the question is, when we look at, in fact, what adversaries are doing, they play in the seams of American law and authorities and organizations, right? So not to get off track, but SolarWinds is an attack, that ultimately the agency within the US government that was focused on the elections also is supposed to be focused on government agency protection. And, they didn't have the capacity to do that. So adversaries went into that seam. We need a whole of nation plus approach to cybersecurity in whether it's on the information side or whether it's in the actual network computing manipulation malware side. And the only way we do that is we get better intergovernmental relations from state to fed, but we got to get a better alignment between the public sector and the private sector, between government and industry. And when I use the word alignment, I mean it differently than the notion of partnership. We've been talking about a public-private partnership in cybersecurity for 25 years, right? And we keep talking about it as if it's going to come. And we made little progress. But partnerships require joint interest to start in the morning. And what we have is we have different interests, which is fine, right? Industry primarily wants to make money. The national security state primarily has got to wake up in the morning worried about security. We can have those different interests, but we can align them better through moderate regulatory reforms that our adversaries can't take advantage of.
And you know how we decide between foreign and domestic, that's gonna be a very interesting idea. I really am interested by that, the seams of the law. It's not a concept that I've heard before, so that really does perk my ears there. Trey, I'm going to come back to you. So we've got a question here from the audience. Ian Wells asked, what's more important, truth or freedom? Can there be freedom of speech if one side controls what's considered the truth? And I want to take that a little bit on it's, so you can respond to that, but also if you're a current elected official and a strong part of your base just doesn't believe the truth, or they've got a different view of what that is, what's the role of the elected official in all of that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I actually remember on January 6th in the morning, I woke up with sort of a brainstorm about how do I as a Republican, how would I as a Republican election administrator or Republican elected official deal with the fact that a large percentage of the Republican Party doesn't trust an election. And some of those concerns might be legitimate, but a lot of them are based upon some illegitimate, some lies and misinformation and disinformation. And I had this, started writing all this stuff down, and then okay, then I've sort of set it aside because we have a very different conversation because of what happened later on the day on the 6th. I mean, I think one is I live in the real world, and so if I'm an elected official, I'm an election official, I have to understand the fact that there's this large percentage of Republicans that need to have their minds change, their concerns addressed, their minds changed, whatever, because that's what they believe. Doesn't make it right. Doesn't mean they're factually accurate, but you can't deny and say, oh, well, this is the best election ever, move on. No, we got to accept the fact that that's out there. And so, we've seen some baby steps with Republicans sticking their necks out on Trump, but Trump's not going to be president after next week. So that's going to leave the members of Congress, the governors, the secretaries to try to do this. And I think I'll go back to what I was talking about earlier is this is where the secretaries have to go on the offensive and start explaining it. I mean, they can't be afraid to go to party events and tell the truth about how elections work. But they also can't be afraid to listen to their folks who have these legitimate questions about potential issues. And I think the other thing is to not exaggerate how smoothly the elections always go. I mean, there are always problems. There always are dead people that vote, and there are people that cheat, and there are mistakes that are made, and votes are missed and things like that. I mean, that happens, and so you can't ignore the things like that, but you can acknowledge that and still say, but look, there's the systematic things aren't there. The widespread things aren't there. This was an election whose outcome you can trust. Then there's some policy things you can do. I mean, we talked about a couple earlier, making sure votes are counted earlier. I'm a big fan of these audits, these risk limiting audits that states and locals are starting to figure out how you don't have to do a full recount, but you can count a number of ballots to confirm not the actual number of votes, who got this number of votes, it's just the outcome. So I can count a few hundred ballots in a lot of races and go with 95% certainty of who wins. And doing those kinds of things can add to comfort, but you just have to engage it head on. Too many Republicans are afraid of their base and of their electorate, and it's not gonna get better until you see more of them engage. I'm proud of the secretaries because I think in general they've done a pretty good job of engaging on this. But they have a very vested interest. Brad Raffensperger in Georgia had a very vested interest in sticking his neck out there. What I want to see are more of the secretaries in other states who weren't maybe as in the battlegrounds doing the same thing so that we can spread these messages far and wide across the country and inside the party.
Great points. Anna, so Trey talks a lot about, not being afraid, and that speaks to courage. And look, in Washington, I think there's not been a lot of courage in Washington, period, for a long time. That's just my observation, my editorial comment. And when I was in politics, there was a lot of spin, and people kind of knew they were spinning, and I think that's probably still true. But I get a sense that there's a growing number of members of Congress that are actually believing in misinformation and believe it to be true. I wanted to know from you, what do you think, what's been covering Congress been like in the digital age?
Yeah, I mean, well, I've been at a digital first publication for 11 plus years, so it's not new. But what I would say is, to your point, I do think there are more, particularly on the Republican side, QAnon supportive members that were certainly elected this cycle, those that have really bought into the Trump MAGA kind of life and things that they support. I think I believe that part of the reason all of that has happened is something that's been happening for years, which has been gerrymandering, right? So if you are a member of Congress on the right or the left, you are really only incentivized to be worried about your people that are more conservative view, if you are more kind of to that lane of conservatism in the Republican Party, or more to the progressive side for Democrats. And so there's very little motivation for anybody to find compromise, for anybody to kind of work together. And so that's why you really see this polarization. And this isn't new, though. There was the rise of the Tea Party. There was the House Freedom Caucus. Now you're seeing this with the Squad potentially, and what's going to happen with Democrats. And so it's really, to me, a breakdown of the party system, because it's very hard for leaders to have control over some of the, kind of fringe elements on both sides. And I think that the other thing that's been, I think, a huge shift to kind of what we've all been talking about here is the direct nature with which members can talk to their constituents and back and forth, the kind of circumventing facts and circumventing the media, in the sense that they can kind of spout off and say whatever they want, whether it's true or not. And there's very little, actual fact checking happening. And to the bigger point is just the lack of, I think, the issue with the media and people not trusting it is a really big issue. And it's an issue that kind of is broader than just the media. It's about institutions, and it's about kind of the societal breakdown that we're really seeing, I think, across this country, which is, I believe, a really big problem. And hopefully we can find ways to shore up some of those institutions, not just, of the media, but also business and all kinds of different, in government and different things.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's a crux of this conversation, is how do we build back the trust of these? So I appreciate that answer. And you bring up a really interesting point about elected officials being able to go directly to the public with social media. I mean, I know when I've been doing campaigns, that's my goal, is to try to sometimes circumvent the old media. It's just what we do. Trey, we get a question here from Angie Bolin, who speaks to that. She says, how do you see the polarized political environment present itself on social media, and how does that contribute to the distrust of election process and the lack of confidence in elected officials? Your observations, since you were there at the dawn of Twitter, and now it's kind of taken on a different life.
Yeah, I mean, you have this, I mean, the term that often is used is filter bubble, where you, in social media, the algorithms are awesome. They tell you what you want. Katie's company does a great job of feeding me information that I want to see, which might be the baby pictures of my kids, or flash, throwback Thursdays from my high school friends. But it also might be, people who share the same political views as me. And I want to, Anna mentioned gerrymandering, but the other challenge we also have as a country is we're seeing a lot more just sorting, where people are kind of living around people with similar ideologies. And so it just starts to kind of reinforce, and you create this echo chamber, and you just don't hear, the other side. And I mean, I do, but it's my job, right? I mean, I'm an attorney, I'm a consultant, JLU, the same thing. Our job is to learn what everything is out there so that we can advise our clients and interact with decision makers in the public and private space. But that's not the way most people live. And so it is a challenge. On the flip side of that is, I love, and I don't want, Katie and I are friends, and she knows I'm not beating up on Facebook. I love Facebook. I love the internet. I love the fact that I can get all this information, and I'm perfectly willing to pay for it because it's so valuable out there. I mean, I think it's great, the work that Politico's done, from its startup days, and I'm excited to see Anna's new project. But it is this challenge. If you only hear certain things, and it really does influence you, and because we're humans, I tend to believe my friends. I have greater trust in my friends because they're my friends. And then on the Republican side, we've done a pretty good job of running against the media, because in general, folks in the media, fairly, this is accurate, factual, tend to go left. I mean, so some of that's on Republicans and conservatives. We need to get more folks to go into the regular kind of media. And so, but the answer to that isn't necessarily like, I don't believe anything that comes out of our mainstream media. It ought to be, I might be skeptical, but I ought to have that skepticism about everything. Yeah. And I should be skeptical if it's coming from my side or anybody else. But these filter bubbles, this reinforcing is it's just a challenge. And if everybody around you is saying, oh, the election wasn't valid, and here's why, and here's this, if there's no counter, you're probably going to believe it. And and that's where, again, as elected officials and government officials and leaders, we have to accept that reality, and figure out a way around it.
Trey, I mean, I think that's spot on, and it's really the bubbles that we create for ourselves are sometimes the biggest problems for each one of us. Katie, so look, we just had this contention. Oh, Richard, you got something?
Yeah, Jake, can I just jump on that
course.
point real quick between what Anna and Trey just said? Because I think it's really important that this notion of sort of these echo chambers that are occurring in the digital space. Anna's point about gerrymandering and Trey's point about partisanship, right? Those are structural variables, right? Those are structures that are coexisting with the information space, and they're reinforcing and amplifying the echo. So gerrymandering is the political equivalent of an echo chamber, right? I mean, you're trying to cut people into space, and then to Trey's point, it reinforces the fact, hey, I want to live here because there's people who think like me, right? So it's not just the digital space, but what we're doing through traditional political, mechanisms like gerrymandering. And then historically, the US goes through these cycles of partisanship. And so we're in this cycle of high partisanship. So you take those three things together, right? And I think that's the space that when we try to think about how do we reestablish trust, we've got a big, big mountain in front of us, right? Because we've got political structural variables and technological reinforcement that's doing it finally on a scale, scope, and speed that's really, really hard for people to keep up with. And so this point about fact checking, yeah, we got to do it, but I think it's something that Trey said earlier, education, right? So fact checking is in the moment. Education is sustained learning. And we've got to, you got to knock things down, absolutely. And Katie can put in policies to try to do it in the height of an election. But what we have to actually do is sustain learning about the systems, about how we compete. And this gets back to civic culture. And I'll leave that thought out there. We haven't talked about civic culture in a long time, really, in this country, right? Something greater and bigger than ourselves, than the partisanship.
Thanks for the interjecting there, Richard. That's really helpful. And Anne, I'm going to come to you for a second. Richard mentioned this term fact checker. Do you ever view yourself as a fact checker nowadays rather than just a reporter?
I think there are people that are actual, like, true fact checkers. The Post has them, CNN has them, particularly I think in the era of the president, reporters felt the need to in real time fact check because he would go, they would be covering him live, and you would, need to kind of put some basis into reality of what he was saying versus what the facts are. So I do think in this kind of very fast and kinetic world, there is a point where you have to call kind of balls and strikes. What is going to happen? Just because somebody says it's going to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. And I would just kind of more broadly say, like, to your point, Richard and Trey, like, I think we're also in an environment, in the news environment, where you're really in a choose your own news environment, right? It's not just where you're located, but it's if you watch, a conservative television and you watch, liberal television or digital media, the same exact event could happen and you wouldn't know that they were the same exact event. And that, to me, is, I think, really dangerous, because you can understand why people feel so strongly about different things, because the information flow that they're getting is so radically different.
I mean, I remember, I'll give you an example to kind of build on what Anna just said. When I was running for the Senate in 2010, it was a Republican primary. It was the height of the Tea Party movement. Go Google me and you can see I'm sort of the tip of the spear in the Tea Party movement, or victim or whatever. But I didn't have time to watch TV or read a lot on the internet because I was out campaigning. But one thing I did is I signed up for an email news alert from Glenn Beck, because Glenn Beck's show on Fox News was the most influential show. And I discovered that if I read his email about what he talked about the day before on his show, it would very likely be the kinds of things I would get asked at my next Republican Party event. And so it was just striking how influential Beck was, and that it kind of nationalizes these federal races are become very nationalized. And if Glenn Beck talked about it, then I had to know about it. And so that's why it was important for me to read that email, because again, I didn't have time to watch the show. But it is, you just have to, you know, these things just influence you, you know, and it's just the reality.
So this is really an interesting concept too, and to both your points and to Anna's point too. Sometimes a different media outlet may choose to cover something that's really important, and one may not. So viewers of those may not even know that happened. So not even looking at it from different prisms. So really interesting concept. Katie, so we just had this contentious election. In 2 years, we're going to have another midterm election here in the States. And in 4 short years, it's going to be another presidential election. And then I don't know if we've ever got time to decompress, but it's coming. How are you and your colleagues preparing?
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. I don't know if there really will be decompression. I think I'm just having hopes and dreams there. So we work globally. You mentioned this at the top. There was just elections in Uganda, Kyrgyzstan. There's elections coming up later this year in Germany. There's quite a few around the world, and so we kind of continually roll from one election to usually working on multiple elections, where we can continue to try to refine the work that we're doing and looking at what's working or not working as part of these. I think there's still a lot. There's a lot that we introduced. You know, the labels on posts. The Voter Information Center was an unprecedented effort that we did to get people to register to vote and try to get people the right information about what was happening. And we also have a huge research effort that we've done with academics to study the 2020 election on our platform, where we expect to see reports of that start coming out later this year. And so right now, I would say we are frankly, right now we're very focused on the next couple of weeks and what's happening over the next couple of weeks and trying to monitor and manage that on the platform. But there's also teams we're working on evaluating and looking at what happened over the last few years, what research we need to do, and start building up already, because 2022 is going to be on top of us before we know it.
Yeah, you mentioned some of those places: Germany, Philippines, India, France. Lots of elections coming down the pike, and I know you work on all of them, and it's just really remarkable. I'm going to stay on that theme for a second, and Richard, come to you. We've got another question from the audience, and this one is from Gregory Winger, and he says, although we're focused on the United States, electoral disinformation and delegitimization are global issues. As journalists, academics, tech platform providers, and government officials, what kind of lessons can we learn from the experiences of other countries in combating digital disinformation? How can we apply those lessons in the United States?
Yeah, no, I think, this is one of the things I think that Katie's getting at. You know, we are trying to absorb this from a research standpoint. These are real time. People think, hey, we can figure it out. But the last time I checked, I'm reading a book right now about the Battle of Britain and the bombing of in World War II of London, right? And there's still new research coming out about World War II.
You read The Wicked and the Vile?
Yeah, there you go.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But so we always have to be careful about research in the moment, right? But there's clear indications, let's say, with regard to the UK. So this is not, here's a critical point that I think the question leads to. This is not just an American problem, right? This is a global problem. Katie's portfolio is global, right? It's a global election portfolio, right? And so we have to actually start to get comparative analysis of what's happening in one place versus another, right? Key things that we're finding is you actually have to have combustible energy, right, in order to have a fire, right? And so you can't necessarily go and make intense partisanship where there isn't intense partisanship. So why is that a relevant observation? If you look globally right now in the electoral space in democratic societies, you do have a divide between populists, I'll just use that broader term, right? Populism, right? And more traditional elite politics. And that, to me, is one of the overall thematics that if we're worried about this at a global level, we have to see, well, who's playing to populists, right? And why do populists succeed? And populists succeed in large measure, not tied to fact, but by giving people what they want to hear, right? And what's interesting is ultimately the business model of much of our technology platforms, right, is to deliver to people what they want to see, hear, feel, right, and experience. It's not about contesting them with different views. So we have this strange place that we've wound up, Jay, globally, right? Each one of us on this call today has more access to more information than any individual human being has had in all of history. And yet, behaviorally, we're not spending a lot of time looking at different sources. So back to Anna's point, we're choosing our news, right? And that, in fact, we tend to choose news that we want to hear, that reinforces our own objectives. So one of the things that I think out of all of this that we have to look comparatively, what are the mechanisms that we get people to challenge themselves, to go and actually view this? Because we can fact check all we want. But if we're not going to actually become more engaged democratic citizens, if we don't protect, we have to actually have a civic duty as citizens in democracy to actually go and vet information ourselves, to actually look at alternatives. It's really inexpensive to get news now. It's really inexpensive to get information. It's all there at our fingertips. So it's a mindset change that we have to have. And I think this is one of the challenges that I would put out to platforms, like Facebook and others, is how do they build off of this model in which we have been trying to structure things and information toward people and actually bring discordant, or at least critical opportunities to be more critical of views into our feeds, right? And that's something that I think we can work cooperatively with in trying to find those trust points, right, that we need to build back into the system.
Jay, can I jump in here on that
Sure.
question? What's interesting in the election spaces, there have always been a fair amount of exchanges between countries and election officials. There's a great worldwide organization, a national organization called the American Council of Young Political Leaders that does exchanges, and where if you're invited to be part of that group, you might go to Australia and learn about something, and then Australians will come to your community. A state legislator from Northern Kentucky, Adam Koenig, I forget the exact issue, but he actually introduced a bill in the Kentucky General Assembly based upon something he learned from that exchange in Australia. And in the election space, there's two federally funded, they're independent private organizations, but the federal government gives them a lot of funding. The NDI, the National Democratic Institute, and the International Republican Institute. These are kind of Cold War era vehicles, and they go in and help democracy build in countries. And so a lot of times election administrators from America will go into other countries. The irony is now I think we need to go learn from, it used to be us going over there to share knowledge. We probably need to pick up on that, but it's the same exchange of information, the same exchange of understandings. I mean, comparative government is an underrated field because there really is a lot you can learn from other countries. And as you said, these trends, populism, disinformation, all these things, the power of the internet, knocking down big organizations and institutions, all of this is happening all around the world. So there are probably some good ideas. And I will say, one of the things I always loved when I was Secretary of State was having the State Department would bring elected officials and bureaucrats from across the world to America on trips. And they would often end up in Kentucky because the Louisville World Affairs Council was really good at hosting. And we've got one in Cincinnati as well. They would always come meet with me because they wanted to learn how America did elections and politics. And when I was Secretary of State or when I worked at Harvard, I did them up there at the Institute of Politics. Those were just great learning opportunities because I would always turn the table and tell me how you do it. I want to hear how you do it. Those exchanges are important, and we got to make sure we continue them going forward.
Appreciate that, Trey. Richard, I'm going to switch subjects to go to the future in terms of what our future threats are. What do you see coming down the pipe?
Yeah, no, I think this is critical, right? We can't we can't prepare for delegitimization campaigns based on fighting the last war, right? And particularly in this space, the technology change is just so rapid. So my big concern, to be perfectly honest with you, I was one of the few people that walked out of this may go over younger people in this crowd, but if you ever see Forrest Gump, there's a scene in Forrest Gump in which Forrest is sitting there and he's at historical events. He's standing right next to Richard Nixon. And everybody that walked out of that movie was crying at the end, except for me. I was horrified, right? Because I said, do you believe that people are going to believe that Forrest Gump, like this character was there with Richard Nixon? Look, deep fake videos, we believe our eyes. Imagine if we had had a video of Brad Raffensperger, in a play, it wasn't him, it's just digitally produced, right? In which he says, we got to just stand against Trump, and I'm going to make sure that he doesn't win. That's a 10-second video, right? And I get his voice and I get his digitally enhancing. We're going to be there technologically in the next window. So again, back to how do we anticipate that, right? How do we defend against that? There are technical defenses, but it's also about getting people to be reserved, taking a little time to figure out. And I think this is where media has to come in and help us as well, right? It's not their fault that we're in a 24-hour by the second breaking news. Does CNN ever actually broadcast something that's not breaking, right? I mean, we're in breaking news all the time, according to their motif, right? We got to slow things down. It's okay if version 2 comes out 3 days later rather than 30 seconds later. And the same thing's going to have to happen in information, because these kinds of deep fakes are going to be extraordinarily hard to contain in the kind of news cycle and absorption that we have. So platforms, like Facebook, are going to have to be very proactive, right, in trying to figure out when that kind of disinformation gets put out.
So you've opened up two different discussion points, which I'm going to come to Katie first and then Anna to respond to. So Katie, let's talk about deepfakes for a second and some other technology that's coming. How does Facebook look at these new threats that are coming that we've kind of seen? We see them in video games, we see them in other places, but they're coming. What are we going to do about it to combat them?
Yeah, one of the things that we've been doing a lot on deepfakes, and we launched, I can't remember if it was the end of 2019 or into 2020, was actually, we need more examples to kind of build up our machine learning capabilities to try to detect these videos as they are happening. And so there's been some partnerships that we have built up with other organizations and universities to try to continue to build up those databases, to build up those detection capabilities for deep fakes as part of all of that. Another thing that we were doing this throughout 2020, and I think we'll keep doing this, is we do regular threat ideation exercises where we all get in a room for a day or two and we all play different roles, and we think about, like, where, if we were these actors, whether it's foreign, domestic, private sector, government, how we might react to different situations, or what we might do for us to try to find holes in our systems and be thinking about what we're seeing. But this is also too, like, why working on international elections is important as well. The things we're seeing in the United States, we weren't the first place for these things to happen. We're probably one of the last places for them to happen in some respects. And so the more that we can learn from those other countries' elections are going to be important as well.
Super interesting. Being the United States not the tip of the spear. I don't know that people really quite understand that. So that was a great comment. Anna, Richard talked about the mainstream media and the role you have a newsletter every day where you're reporting news all the time. What role does the mainstream media play in giving people confidence?
Yeah, well, a couple things. I mean, I think Richard was saying too, that he wants people to slow down. I came into Washington, 15 plus years ago, and I wrote a bi-weekly newsletter. I now write a 3 times a day newsletter. So I think that just gives you a sense of the speeding up of the news cycle. And I whether we wanted to slow down or not, I would like to get more sleep and not have to get up super early. I don't see the news cycle and the 24-hour, kind of system slowing down anytime soon. I think if there's a lot of, I think Trey was talking about the bias in the media. To me, the true real bias in the media is friction points. It's conflict, because that is what people read. much more than whether or not people are motivated by, being conservative or being liberal. I really do think that that is where the tension points are, what are the dramatic stories are what do well. And I think, listen, I think the media, I always try to say this, like, I can't be responsible for the entire media, just like Katie can't be responsible for every tech platform or every politician in the world, right? I mean, I think we take it very seriously that, our role as kind of being the voice to narrate Washington and what we do and making sure that it is accurate. I think that, to me, the real issue, and this isn't my space at all, but it's really community journalism. I think that we're seeing a fundamental breakdown of communities, and part of that is losing your local newspaper. And, as much as I've focused on misspending and congressional misdeeds, focusing on what happens with the bus contracts is super important, right? And it's really at that minor, that lower level that kind of has much more of an people are installed and feel like they're part of a community. So if there's anybody that can solve the local news problem that's happening and the consolidation, that I think actually would have a lot more of an impact than whatever CNN is doing or whatever, frankly, Punchbowl News is doing on actual local communities.
I can't disagree more. I mean, look, local news, even in my time here, it diminishes every day, and it's a huge problem for our country, too. And I don't think people actually quite grasp what that is. Beyond the jobs, it's just the quality of news that we're getting.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it's a lot about like the fabric of community life, right? And that used to be your local newspaper where you saw what was happening and all kinds of different things. And for the most part, yeah, it's not just, I mean, like, of course I want more journalists around, but I think it's just, it really has this kind of echo chamber that you're missing at kind of a lot of the local levels.
So look, we're kind of at the end of the hour here, and I'm respectful of everyone's time, but I've got a ton of questions coming in. I've got a ton more questions. We could do this for 3 hours, but Richard, I'm going to give you the last word. Everyone wants a quick fix. It's not coming. You alluded to something earlier. So quickly, if you can kind of give us what the prescription is, what is the roadmap for all of us to follow to kind of start solving some of these problems?
Well, I'm going to give you that answer for free. No,
yeah,
okay.
Yes, you are.
Right. Well, I think it's actually what Katie referred to, right? It's the tech platforms working with different constituencies, whether it be in academia, whether it be in media, whether it be in the political realm, right? And actually tried to think through in an anticipatory way, right? What are the possible? What is the realm of the possible? And so that we can start to work backwards, right? And cut off some of these things before they actually get some momentum. So it is working right now on a continual and intentional way to reinforce trust in democracy. Right? We have taken it for granted. What I think the last month or so has shown us is that while we talk about ourselves as a country of laws, we actually are, in fact, a country of norms. And those norms have been breaking down. And it's going to require leadership, both at the individual citizen level, all the way up to the new administration and in between, right? To intentionally continue to work through all of our different organizations to not take trust for granted and reach out to those people who have lost it and bring them back in to this system. It's the greatest system that's been built to govern individuals. It'd be a shame if we lost it.
Well, it's actually, look, first, you're an expert on this, and I'm glad you're briefing some of their elected leaders on this. To our panel, I really want to thank you. This is truly an all-star panel, people that know what they're doing. They're leaders in these really important institutions in our country. So thank you very much to Anna, to Katie, to Trey, and to Richard. And I'm going to leave you, Research and Innovation Week, again, is happening on March 29th to April 2nd, 2021. So please mark your calendars, because lots of conversations, including this one, which will be highlighted during that time. Our Flashpoint series will be ongoing, and we'll be doing lots more of these. So want to thank everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.